back to database management. In this module, you will learn everything about stored procedures. We will look at how stored procedures work and at the differences between what stored procedures are and what they do, and what triggers are and what they do. Then we will build, test, and use two simple stored procedures. Let's first look at the difference between stored procedures and triggers. A stored procedure essentially is a little program that lives inside of your database. The official definition is that it is a segment of declarative SQL statements that are stored inside of the database catalog. Now, a stored procedure can be invoked by triggers, other stored procedures, or external applications, such as any code that you embed in a web page, older PHP, Java code, anything that you can use in order to make an external function call. Stored procedures, just like triggers, are stored and compiled in the RDBMS, but the difference is here that a trigger occurs automatically in response to a database operation, and that database operation occurs on a table. So a trigger is specific to an insert, update, or delete operation that is performed on a table, whereas a stored procedure is a global operation that can be performed on the database itself. So stored procedures, to summarize, are executed in response to a user request, and triggers are executed in response to an operation on a table. Now, the most important thing to remember is that whenever we write stored procedures or triggers, they can contain more than one SQL statement. This also means we need to figure out what to do with our semicolon that so far has delimited our commands at the end of one line. What if we want to write an SQL statement inside of a stored procedure or a trigger that in fact is not just one statement but a number of them? Here we have to remember to temporarily change the delimiter. Now let's look at stored procedures in a little more detail. Essentially, stored procedures are thought to increase the performance of Oracle, DB2, or MySQL. The stored procedure in MySQL works kind of like a query that is stored. They help reduce the traffic between application and database server because instead of sending multiple SQL statements, you have a little program that executes with parameters, right? So they are reusable and transparent to any applications, and they expose the database interface to the applications so that the developers don't have to develop any specific functions anymore that are already stored in these stored procedures. And stored procedures, lastly, are secure. DBAs can grant permissions to applications or specific users to execute these. So that is one of the advantages of stored procedures. On the other hand, though, stored procedures, when they run, because they run multiple SQL statements at a time, potentially, they can use a lot of memory, and it's not as easy to test them, as we will see. So how do you write a stored procedure? Well, the first thing we need to take care of and we need to remember for each stored procedure is the delimiter. The delimiter is being reset at the beginning of the stored procedure so that we can insert multiple SQL statements that are all delimited with the basic semicolon, right? But we want to make sure that these are inserted as a code block. So this is why we reset the delimiter at the beginning of inserting our stored procedure. And after we have inserted our stored procedure in the database, we have to reset the delimiter again to our semicolon. Otherwise, it'll be very uncomfortable making that call and everything. So That is the most important thing to remember, and that's where most of the errors occur. Then a stored procedure is being inserted with a simple create command, just like a create table, a create view, create procedure, right? And then we create the procedure with a name. Here in our example, it's all transactions. And then we have our parens here. The parens, as we will see a little bit later, are there so that we can insert arguments. The next thing we do is we start the procedure with begin. That signals MySQL that now comes the SQL code that we want MySQL to execute. And we end the stored procedure with end. And after the term end, we see here the same delimiter that we have specified up here, because that shows MySQL that this is the end of the code block that we want to execute as a block. The next thing we then do is we insert the SQL statement. Here it's just a basic select here. Once we have hit enter after using the reset delimiter, you will see the query OK, typically, and then please remember to reset that delimiter as you're seeing here. Once you've done that, you can call the stored procedure with the call operator, and then with whatever arguments here, no arguments, because we don't have any arguments that are being used in our SQL statement, and with the semicolon again as the reset delimiter. If you're working in MySQL Workbench, you will see that the stored procedures are part of the overall database schema, and they're being held in a separate area for stored procedures. You right-click on the stored procedures area here, and then from the pop-up you will be able to select create stored procedure, which will open up a tab that says new procedure, which you can then rename. The name for a stored procedure has to be unique inside of a database, just in the same way in which the name of a view or the name of a table has to be unique. That's because a stored procedure is, just like any of the others, a database object. The new procedure in MySQL Workbench here starts with create procedure, and then whatever you want to call the procedure. And you have the begin and the end showing here like this. There is no need to set and reset delimiters because MySQL Workbench automatically inserts the stored procedure into the database as soon as you hit apply. Remember the little stored procedure that we wrote just a few moments ago? Well, here it is. All transactions is stored inside of the stored procedures area of our database schema here. And if you click on all transactions, you will see this here. You will see here the create definer, which is who wrote and who owns the stored procedure, then the name of the stored procedure, and then you will see the expander here that expands the code block between begin and end that actually will run once the stored procedure is called. Now let's think about this business case. We have developed a new program, which is a premium plan program. The premium plan program gives our customers advanced viewing rights to movies that we're going to offer next month. So for that, we are going to have to store a flag in our person table that either marks a person as a premium plan customer or not. We want to be able to update this premium plan status without having to go through an entire update table sequence every single time. That's why we're going to write a stored procedure to update our person table with our premium plan flag. Here's how we're going to go about this. First, we're going to set our delimiter again, because resetting our delimiter tells MySQL that what follows will be a code block that is delimited by the regular semicolon. Then we're going to create our procedure. Now this time our procedure is going to be created not with empty parens, but with the variables, the attributes that we want to work with inside of those parens. And these are the attributes that are going to be filled from the command line. So for us, that is our PID and our PP switch that will then interact with our person ID and our premium plan column in our person table, because this is where we're going to have to set and compare this information. Now what you're seeing here is in the structure of our input variables here, we have the same data type and the same length as the columns in the table that we're updating. Why is this important? Well, what if I want to set a premium plan to say the word yes? That's 3 characters, but in my table I can fit only 1 character, namely the Y. Then my stored procedure will error out. This is why it's so important to constrain the input here correctly into the stored procedure to the format of the table column into which this information will be inserted. So now we have our begin and our end, and then we have our SQL statement in which we update our table with the table name of person, that's this table here, and we're going to set premium plan. Now that's this attribute here inside, or this column inside of our person table, to the contents of our input attribute, this PP switch attribute here, where, and then the person ID again is the column in our person table, equals, and then the PID, which is our first input attribute here that we're getting from the command line, because all we're doing when we want to call this procedure is to pass to it the person ID as PID and whether or not that person is a premium plan customer or not. And that would be our PP switch Y or N right here. So the next thing that we're seeing here, oh, look at that. Here is what happens when you don't reset the delimiter. Do you see how I wanted to describe the person table? And here I have my semicolon, but nothing happened, and I got this prompt here, which tells me that your SQL command is not complete. So I had to use the delimiter that I had reset here. I could not use my semicolon because I haven't reset the delimiter yet. So of course I did that afterwards. But what that tells you is that sometimes when you forget to reset your delimiter, this is what will happen to you. So always remember to reset your delimiter after you have entered your stored procedure into your MySQL database. So how do we call a stored procedure? To remind ourselves, this is our stored procedure. This is the operative SQL statement inside of our stored procedure. And these are the columns that we need from our person table. We are looking to change the contents of the premium plan column based on what we receive from our user through the command line, based on also the person ID, namely the PID that we receive as input, that is going to select the appropriate row based on the person ID that we have in our person table. So we pass, as you can see, the arguments PID and PP switch into the stored procedure when we call it, with call procedure and then the name of the procedure and then the attributes or the variables that we are going to pass. We're seeing this here with our call change PP and then 15 and Y. So we are passing the 15 as the person ID that we're filtering for, and we want to change this null value into Y. And then as we see in the output, as we look again at these two columns in our person table, that is exactly what has happened. So let's summarize. At this point, we have talked about how stored procedures work and what the differences are between stored procedures and triggers. We have also built, tested, and used two simple stored procedures. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video.